So what I want to do during this session, though, is give you a little bit of an understanding of the enforcement of this program. In your handbook, after the PowerPoint slides, I've given you the fact sheets for each of the animals who fall under the care standards, the Ohio Livestock Care Standards. And you can see there that those cover dairy, beef, swine, turkeys, broilers, sheep, goats, alpacas, llamas, and equine. No rabbits again. Maybe we should all think about raising rabbits. They seem to be an unregulated commodity. So we have these new regulations now that establish standards of care that we must provide for our animals. And those standards cover feed and water, along with health, management, transportation of the animals, and euthanasia of the animals. And they became effective last September 29th. You can find them, if you want to read through all of them, in the Ohio Administrative Code, which is available online. And I've given you the section there of the Ohio Administrative Code. So now the burden is on you as the livestock operator to comply with the standards. They're in effect. They're regulations that apply to you, and you are now bound to comply with them. So, as I said before, ODA, as the enforcer here, has developed a whole series of fact sheets. They have a good number of resources on their website. Have any of you been on there to see those fact sheets? Along with a fact sheet, there's a guide, which is a more detailed publication. And then they also have videos for each of those sections that I named, something on food and water, on transportation. And in those videos, the state veterinarian or the director explains, okay, here's what we mean by these standards. So pretty good information available online. And of course, as I said, it's your burden now to make sure that you know and understand the standards. So what happens if there is an operator who doesn't know the standards, who doesn't comply with them? Well, the Ohio Department of Agriculture is the enforcer here, but they've made it very clear that this is not an inspection program. They're not going to be going out to farms and inspecting to see if people are in compliance with the standards. Instead, this is a complaint-driven program. So ODA just sits and waits for complaints to be made. And if there is a credible complaint, then they will do something. Their goals in taking this approach is to bring everybody up to compliance. Their hope is that most of us already are in compliance, but being that we have these new regulations, they're acknowledging, well, it may take people a while to learn about those regulations, to understand them, to implement the measures that may need to take place. So our goal is to help them learn, help the producers learn, bring them into compliance. We're not going to be out there looking for people who are violating the standards.
I have a question for you. You're saying producers. Does this also apply to those people that just have animals on their property, not producing them?
Yes, it could. Now, there are a few exemptions. A 4-H animal, for instance, would be exempt. But for the most part, if you are raising these animals, you're going to be required to be in compliance. It sounds like your question is if we don't sell them for processing or...
I'm sitting there thinking about numerous people with horses. I read through that one really well.
Oh, definitely horses are covered, yes. Unless, you know, the 4-H, as I said, 4-H...
No, they're not 4-H horses.
Or some science research type, there are some exceptions for those.
No, I'm just talking if you know of people that they're their personal horses, they're doing for production, they don't use them in a business. If they're not following the standards,
then they could be subject to a complaint, yes. That's a good question, because producers does sound as though, oh, you're...
It sounds like what
in
we're doing, where we are
the business of
producing
producing.
cattle to be sold.
Right. Good question. So, as I said, ODA is sitting and waiting for complaints to come in. They're not out there looking for problems. So after receiving a credible complaint, then they are going to take action to investigate the complaint. So what is a credible complaint? Well, I've talked to the people at ODA about that, and this is their explanation. A credible complaint is one that does not specify facts, or it doesn't really allege an act that would be a violation of the standards. So if someone calls in with some pretty general information, doesn't really have any facts, they may not consider that to be a credible complaint. Likewise, if someone is calling in complaining about something for which there is no care standard, that's not going to be a credible complaint. So if they do receive a credible complaint, then they have the authority to come out and investigate, and they will come out and investigate the situation. So they show up at the farm. As I said, they have the authority to investigate. Do they have the authority to enter the barn without your permission? No, they don't. They will ask for your permission. They'll explain to you what's going on, what the complaint was, and ask if they could investigate, see your barn, see your situation. At that point, it's up to you as the animal owner to either give them permission or deny permission. If you would deny permission, then they would have to go back and seek an administrative search warrant in order to come out and further investigate on the farm. So there's a decision to think about as the owner. Will you grant permission if they show up on your doorstep? Or will you force them to come back with a search warrant? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So they'll investigate, they'll come into the barn or the pasture, wherever the animals are, and just assess the situation as it pertains to the complaint that they received. And they'll talk with you, they'll walk with you. It's helpful if you're there, because you can be there and you can be taking them around and showing them your facility. And then the investigator will issue a report, and that report will either say there's not a compliance issue here, or yes, we do have a compliance issue. It relates to this specific standard, and here are our recommendations for how you can correct this problem. That will be their first course of action, is to provide corrective measures to you so that you can bring your facility into compliance. And they'll give you a certain amount of time to do that. If you don't do that, then they can take the step of actually formally issuing a notice of violation to you. And that will be a written notice of violation. And you have the possibility of civil penalties that would come with that. After you receive that notice of violation, you have an appeal period where you can appeal that. Where you can request a hearing. We're not to the appeal yet. You have a period where you can request a hearing with the administrative hearing officer. And that's an attorney who is not an employee of ODA, who oversees the hearing, much like a little judicial session, kind of like a little court session. And the ODA and its investigator will present your violation, and you will have an opportunity, either yourself or hopefully through your attorney, to respond to that allegation. Then that hearing officer will make a decision, and then you have the right to appeal that decision outside of the agency to the court in that Court of Common Pleas for your area. So that's the process that they would follow in order to find you in violation. Now there are two different penalties, two different types of violations. There are minor violations and major violations. The minor ones are going to be for those unintentional acts. So you didn't intend to be violating. It's just something maybe that you didn't know, or this space wasn't sufficient. An unintentional act or an act of neglect. Those would be a $500 fine, up to $500. And then if you would violate again within 5 years, then that fine would go up to $1,000. So these are just civil penalties. There's no criminal penalty, no jail time that would come from violating these. The major violations are going to be those that are reckless or that place an animal in higher danger. So we're looking more for intentional acts, acts that kind of create this unnecessary pain or discomfort for the animals. And some examples that are listed in the regulations: an act that places the animal's life in danger, causes long-term disfigurement or health impairments, or causes the loss of a limb or an organ. Those kinds of acts are going to be considered major violations, and you can be fined up to $5,000 for the first offense, and then up to $10,000 if you commit a second offense within 5 years. So we could get into some serious penalties here for those kinds of reckless or intentional acts. So what's happened since the standards went into effect in late September? Well, ODA has received 34 complaints. Not all of those are credible. Some of those have been set aside as not being a credible complaint, and so no investigation occurred. But the majority were perceived by ODA as credible, and so they have conducted a number of investigations. In almost all of the cases, they issued corrective measures recommendations, and those measures were taken, and there's been no notice of violation given to the animal owner. There are still a handful of cases, though, that are sitting there, and they're waiting to see if those producers are going to take corrective measures, and they may have to go ahead and take the step of issuing a notice of violation. So to date, it seems to be pretty quiet. Not a lot of controversy, not a lot of big issues where there's some pretty awful things taking place on a farm. So it seems to be a little more quiet than they expected, actually. When I've talked to ODA, they said, well, we kind of expected, we were getting all these calls from all these people about all these terrible things taking place on Ohio farms, but so far, 34. Is that about what you all would have expected? How many months has that been now? September, October, November, December, January, February.
How many of those have shown up on YouTube?
That's not that. I don't think there's a lot of people that know about this.
You don't think so?
There's more than you think.
I hope there are a lot who know about it. But you know what, as ODA says, most of these standards, they think, in their opinion, are management practices that most producers are already doing. And so there shouldn't be a lot of discrepancies out there between what people are doing and what the standards require. I don't know. Would you agree with that, Tony? Think so?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the swine industry has specifically been earmarked or targeted. The dairy industry would be the second area that we've seen targeted aspects to it. And those industries have tried doing a pretty good job within the industry and within the producers to address things that keep things from becoming complaints, such as proper animal handling or whatever setting. For example, one area would be the swine industry has set a standard for euthanasia practices for different size swine, for different age and different size. So that would be an area where if there was an in-house complaint given to ODA, as long as they were following appropriate industry standard euthanasia practices, ODA would look at that as probably not a credible, but they may still call upon it, but from what I can tell. But I think too, the other thing that we're seeing in our area is you still have a lot of complaints still going to local officials, humane society.
Right, and that's actually the next topic. Right.
So,
yes,
and there's a filter system there within that kind of helps.
Oh, you think that helps?
Well,
if people go there first.
I think in some regards there are still some humane societies out there within Ohio that still think they're above what ODA is. And I don't mean that disrespectful, but they take it on head on. But I'm thinking that you know, when the animal standards was brought about, they have representation from the Humane Society that should be trickled down into their organization to know when to filter it to ODA as a legitimate complaint that ODA needs to tackle.
Right, and that is a concern, but as Tony said, a member from representing Humane Societies was on the Livestock Care Standards Board, is still on the board, and so we hope there is some transference there of information, because most people are more familiar with the Humane Society than they are with this program. And so if they do see an incident that looks like animal neglect or abuse, they're more likely to go to the local county Humane Society. And so that raises a question of, well, how do these two sets of laws work together? We've got now the livestock care standards that apply to our farm animals, and we have the animal cruelty law in Ohio that applies to all animals generally. So is it possible that someone would go over here to the County Humane Society and complain about animal cruelty to a farm animal, and it would be the Humane Society who would investigate rather than the ODA? And the answer is yes, that's possible. We would hope that that County Humane Society would be talking with ODA, or would recognize that, oh, this isn't really an animal cruelty case, it's a livestock care case, and we need to refer it over to them. But there could be overlap, and there could be both of those agencies brought out onto the farm to investigate. And there could actually be an incident that would be a violation of both the standards and animal cruelty law. So I thought that we might see a little more messiness when this first started, but it doesn't seem to be the case. But what we don't know is how many of those County Humane Society incidents really should have been investigated over here with ODA. We don't know that yet. But there's that potential overlap and the potential of two different agencies investigating a situation with animals on the farm. If you look at our animal cruelty law, and this is included in your handbook, that law specifically prohibits these kinds of acts: neglect in the way of not providing adequate food, water, or shelter. And those are very similar to some of the standards that we have in the livestock care standards. But it also prohibits things like torturing animals, beating animals, killing them, mutilating them. And again, some of those are kind of duplicative of what we have in the care standards. There are some provisions in that part of the code about making sure you're not stressing an animal too much in transportation, and that's similar to our standards. But these provisions carry criminal penalties. You can have a second-degree misdemeanor, a $750 fine, and possibly 90 days in jail for each offense, which can be each animal that's been neglected or abused. So that's what the animal cruelty law looks like. And you see some similarities there between the two. Might be that a county would decide, ooh, we're going to pursue this option because it does carry criminal penalties, and we want to make it a criminal act rather than sending it over to ODA where it'll just be a civil penalty. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see if we have any changes in enforcement through the County Humane Society. In your book, as I said, there is a fact sheet for each species that kind of gives you an overview of what those standards are. And if you would look at those, I think you would see that a lot of those are, as Tony said, industry-wide standards or best management practices, or the kinds of things that we would expect that producers are already doing. But it'll be interesting to see how it keeps playing out. So back to the animal cruelty law. That law, as I said, is enforced by the local Humane Society, and they do have similar authority as the ODA. They have that investigative authority. They have the authority to gauge whether someone is making a credible complaint And many of our humane societies, you can fill out an email form and complain about an instance of neglect. You can leave a voicemail. So pretty simple procedures for lodging a complaint against someone. But once that complaint is lodged, then very similar to ODA where there's investigation. They have the right to seize animals that might be abused or neglected, and also, as I said, authority for penalties and criminal prosecution. So, any questions about those two different sets of standards and how they fit together and what obligations they create for you as those who raise animals? I think an interesting thing to think about, and you kind of raised this in some of your questions, are smaller operators who are, big agriculture. Are they exempt from this? Because we do have some, special exemptions for smaller operators or those who might not be in a commercial business. And that's not the case with these standards. It does apply to everyone who's raising an animal with those few exceptions that I noted. Jeff?
Peggy, do you think the livestock care standards could actually help support a farmer in terms of this split responsibility? What I'm thinking of, just give you an example. Here in this county, we have a very zealous humane society.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think they were issued a ban that they even drive around to do it. She said in the paper she'd like to have a badge. That's what she's seen her role. So, and what I'm getting at is, she called me one time and said, she was concerned about this hog farm, that the sows were too thin, and in her estimation anyway, and she wanted to pursue, going through a process with them. So I started quizzing her. I said, well, what do you think? Can you tell me what the protein level that a sow should be? What kind of body condition score should a sow be in when she exits a barrel crate? She had no knowledge of production agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm getting at. Is
right.
If a farmer had a visit from the sheriff, that he could say, we have livestock care standards, and I would like to call ODA and have them step in.
Right.
Is that process in place for that to happen?
The thing that's not in place is the requirement that county humane society refer it over to ODA. That's what's missing, and that's what I'm worried about. At what point do we make sure it shifts? The law doesn't specifically require that. ODA has been willing to say, if it looks to us like a cruelty, a torture type, we have no problem sending it over to them. But, we have 88 different county humane societies taking 88 different positions, and whether they'll shift it over, if they can stand up and say, well, this really is about farm animal care, and I don't understand that well enough, so I'm going to send it to ODA. I don't know. I think there has been an effort made to educate them, but is it sufficient? Or do we need some mechanism in the law that says you are required in any farm animal instance to send it to ODA and let them decide where it should be? I don't know.
I think if you would
Not
have had
there.
a more severe winter, we'd have more case studies to know whether to ask that question more directly. Mild winter, I'm not seeing the concerns, because of the mild winter. So,
Mm-hmm.
Right now it might be policing itself between the two
Mm-hmm.
segments of that. But in a harsher winter, where is that fine line of animal care standards versus what that, and like Jeff said, is there a place in the Humane Society's procedures that they can request ODA to step in and say, I want ODA to come in and investigate this, not you.
Right.
It's typical. In March, in this area, cows are going to be standing in mud, horses are going to be standing in mud. So somebody files a complaint, these animals are out by the road, they're all muddy. An ODA can say, well, every horse and cow that's outside in Ohio is muddy right now.
Yeah, and that's where they can say that's not
Roll. Horse lays down roll.
their nature.
Yeah,
That's where they can say this is not a credible complaint because you're not really alleging a violation of the standards. But I think it's a little different when we're over in the animal cruelty law and looking at how they're basing their credible complaints, what they're basing those on. So I expect that we'll see some problems between the two at some point. Whether they're serious enough, I don't know.